So we covered already all the different elements you need to understand in research, the basics, the firm research, the environmental research, and the importance of asking the right questions to get the right answers. In this section, we'll discuss about research design issues such as cultural bias, data equivalence, and perceptions of data, and how to interpret that better as an international marketer in foreign markets, plus the importance of primary and secondary research. So, in cultural bias, bias is inherent with every market researcher, and it is important for us to formulate methodologies and research questions that address, try to minimize or remove those biases as much as possible. As an international marketer, you're going to be dealing with inherent biases you may not be aware of, and that is challenging in itself. So I always want you to take yourself out of your own shoes and think of yourself, what would I want, how would I feel if somebody was to research my market and myself as a sample, a market sample, and if they got those things wrong, how would I feel about that? And I think that would help you hopefully see the ethnocentrism you may be facing in your research. So try to remove yourself from your own shoes and hopefully see the other side and why it's important to have the right research. Cultural bias is the lacking of familiarity of another culture, and that may interpret the data relating to that culture. It is important to know that it's going to always be there, and please watch this video link. I'll share it in the video supplemental material. In cultural bias, things that we typically look at are the attitudes, the behaviors that are expressively differ from our own, or what we're expected in our own culture. The common thing is that we would interpret in our own mind what we think that the data means, and entirely that comes with that bias, and we need to be careful of that. So suppose as a respondent attaches little value to innovation compared to maybe us, or expresses conservative opinions about sexual behavior. Say you're dealing with a conservative Christian organization in your American market. You would want to be careful how you take out data from that if you are marketing products that are sexual in nature, or you want to market products in a sexual nature. So be careful of those differences. And that could be amplified in foreign markets where nuance is harder to find. How does this affect the market response? Well, for example, the respondent will react negatively to products that appeal to sex. So you wouldn't want that out there. So, for example, in an international setting, in the Arabic-speaking world and parts of Africa, you wouldn't want to show sexual content or sexual explicit type material that may be seen as explicit, but in our culture is not. So be aware of that. Surveys. Well, surveys are amazing because now we're dealing with data that's primary. I'm surprised I don't cover that right away. Surveys are a great way to ask people questions, but how effective are they? And all that, of course, depends on how you design it and interpret the data and how you sample the data. Surveys are affected by respondents' cultural impressions. How do they rate answers? Acquiescence effect describes the tendency of a person to be affirmative or negative to a questionnaire. How are they going to respond to you because they want to be that way, because they feel that they need to be negative for you or they need to be positive for you, will be altered based on your culture. For example, some cultures are very much like we don't want to show a negative effect on something, like say, how greatly satisfied were you, or how greatly negatively satisfied were you, or unsatisfied were you. You want to be careful with that distortion in your assessment. These effects can be avoided when items are presented in bipolar manners or with verbal explanations, or you're having a better scaling system to help hopefully answer those. For example, if you only stop at 5, maybe stop at 50 or 100. So keep that in mind. Response bias is the tendency of a person to answer a question on a survey untruthfully or misleadingly because of the first. For example, respondents may feel pressure to give answers that are socially acceptable, or that respondents may not be aware that they are answering the question the way we had intended because the question wasn't correct, or formulated in a way that was going to get the response that we were hoping for. You gotta be careful. The formulation is to not create an answer, it's to get an answer. How do we see these tendencies play out? In the level of acquiescence, where respondents tend to want to be careful with negative responses or extreme responses, we see here some countries are midpoints. In Japan, let me point here, in Japan and South Korea, they tend to have a midpoint response. They don't want to be very much in the negative or the positive. Showing their feelings is seen as challenging and negative in their culture. In the UK, you get the exact same thing. In the UK, which is in the European side, getting an answer of how somebody really feels is always a major challenge, and seen as in comedy, a joke. Some countries where you can see responses more extreme or allowed, but are lower, Australia. Then you see it go higher, where people would like to give higher extreme responses, or give their truth. You would see Americans, Chinese, Mexico, Brazil. I think that was Mexico. They cut that off, but for sure Brazil. So you have to look at data acquiescence and data response biases and how people respond to surveys. So be careful with that in different markets. You'll see general patterns, and then that you can extrapolate data in a different way. Hopefully you'll find better data interpretation. How is the response style by culture? Let's break it down a little further. Latin American respondents are likely to adapt extreme response styles, meaning they have high acquiescence. They'll tell you the truth. Chinese respondents tend towards higher acquiescence bias as well, but more even distribution. So you'll see that the scale needs to be wider, so you get a better idea of are they more on the left or the right of your response. US is fairly evenly distributed, but they tend to have higher acquiescence, meaning they will tell you the truth. But Western Europe is like the US in most ways, that the response distribution will be kind of more extreme, but how you get their responses, the acquiescence, will be in the midpoint. So be careful. That acquiescence of are they really telling you the truth will be harder to discern. So I'm not going to go into all these, but just keep in mind each one has their own. I'll make these slides available. Constructing data equivalence in your research. Data equivalence is taking those acquiescences and those biases that I just discussed and finding a way to equivocate, or might be saying the word wrong, but to find equivalence into our data when we construct the extrapolation of data. So we want to know that when it comes in, we are understanding it's one-to-one. So when I see it with my bias, I get what was said, not what was intended or what I might have created. We're trying to make it where into interpretation, even though the data was required in a different way or set up in a different way, the sampling and all, we were able to get it one-to-one for our interpretation. So that's what we're looking at, or vice versa, depending on how you look at it. So data equivalence looks at concepts of how culture is viewed. We have functional equivalence, where concepts or objects or behaviors are studied may not necessarily be functionally equivalent. So we want to know that in data questions, what bikes are used for. In the US, it's for recreational purposes, whereas in China and the Netherlands, it's a mode of transportation. So we want to ask questions that are geared towards understanding that market's behaviors and needs. Conceptual equivalence, the interpretation that individuals place on objects, stimuli, or behavior that are expressed in similar ways but differently in different cultures and countries. The concept of high school proms is not big outside the United States. That's an American concept. So we exclusively emphasize secondary education as a big deal compared to other countries. Not to say they don't, they just do it differently. And not that they don't have proms, they have balls in Austria and South Germany as a big deal. So, category equivalence relates to this idea that objects or stimuli are placed, or where they're placed, relevant to class definitions of one country to another. In the Netherlands, milk is consumed with meals as a soft drink or as a normal drink that you have, anybody would have, adults, children, or not. Whereas in the United States, it's something we give our kids. So you'll see that's a very different market behavior. Primary and secondary data researches. Primary market research is what we just discussed, where we're going out and actually asking market information that's not there already. It's new, and it's made and designed by us. So it's information that comes directly from the source. And primary research, even if you bought it from somebody, like say they did a research for you, that would be primary. They're doing a research for you that nobody else has or needs. So it's personal interviews, their questionnaires, their surveys, their focus groups, their market engaged based research. Here you get the best data, but the highest risk of data being biased or incorrectly done. So it isn't, if you're buying it out to somebody, it is imperative you do the right understanding, or you have the right understanding of research methodology, so you're not getting biased information or screwed by the person providing you their service. Secondary research is everything like this. Your trade data sources, anything that's not done by you, where anybody could really access the information. It's secondary, it's second use. Others make it, anybody could use it. It's research gaps there. So always be careful with secondary data. The less developed a market is, the less likely the accuracy of the data is. Even from export.gov. I'm going to say it out there. CIA World Factbook or export.gov, in super tiny markets where data and obtaining data is very hard, currency convertibility issues or whatever, makes it understanding that market's actual GDP or actual performance on a particular industry hard to know. So be careful with secondary data depending on the developed side of the market, as well as the transparency of the market and the trustworthiness of those sources. So that said, be careful with data and primary research. Have fun with it, but be aware of what's going on, and that your role is to remove your bias where possible and understand the equivalencies that you can create to help you understand data better so you can make better decisions.